Hello, I'm Father Robert Spitzer from the Magis Center of Reason and Faith. Many of you may be curious about Dr. Stephen Hawking's recent statements about heaven being a dream, a fairy tale, a non-reality. I don't think this claim has any validity at all, and for three reasons. The first is that Dr. Hawking is a physicist, and you might think that as a physicist, he's making a claim from the vantage point of physics. Evidently, heaven is not something in the physical universe, and you really can't derive too much about heaven from knowing physics. Heaven may be viewed as another thought in the mind of God. Our universe may be one thought, and heaven might be another thought in the mind of God, and God can connect them intellectually, but heaven is not some extension of our physical universe. And so one would have to say from the very beginning that Dr. Hawking's expertise in physics is not going to get him very far in information about heaven. The second thought is that Dr. Hawking has offered absolutely no evidence for this claim. There's an old expression in philosophy, arbitrarily asserted, arbitrarily denied. And in this particular case, Dr. Hawking has, without any evidence, arbitrarily asserted that heaven is not a reality. But of course, if you give no evidence for that claim, one can turn right around and make another claim without any evidence that heaven is a reality, and there's no way, of course, of resolving the dispute because they were both done without evidence. The third thing is perhaps the most important. There actually is a considerable amount of evidence that has been gleaned not from theology, not from the theology that goes back to perhaps Jewish scriptures or Christian scriptures, but rather one can glean from empirical science, from medicine, and also from philosophy, and actually from the philosophy of mathematics. What I'd like to do is just talk about some of the evidence that Dr. Hawking failed to note when he made his rather remarkable claim. First, some thoughts about near-death experiences. A near-death experience is one that occurs to a person. Perhaps they have a heart attack, perhaps they drowned, but whatever the reason, the brain becomes, as it were, described as dead. So we're talking about brain death or clinical death, and that would be marked by a flat EEG, an electroencephalogram, which would indicate that there's no electrical activity in the cortex, and also that there is no activity in the brainstem, and that would be marked by fixed and dilated pupils, and also by the absence of a gag reflex. Now, when all of these conditions are present, one is justified in considering a patient to be brain dead, and therefore that they really shouldn't have any visual, sensorial perceptions, and certainly should not be able to make accurate descriptions of things going on in an operating room. Well, over 30 years of study of near-death experiences with excellent controls. There are several studies that are reported in the finest peer-reviewed journals in medicine. For example, The Lancet, which is Britain's finest medical journal, and the Journal of the American Medical Association for Diseases of Children. These very fine journals have reported many studies and also a series of other works. For example, Chris Carter's very good work on science of near-death experiences, and also the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences. They try to show these 30 years of research and try to look at some of the conclusions that we can gather. What I'd like to do is talk about these conclusions very briefly through, for example, the study that was presented in The Lancet, Britain's medical journal, by Van Lommel and Associates. Dr. Van Lommel did a very extensive longitudinal study over multiple hospitals and multiple patients with a series of control groups. And he noted the following things. First, he noted that he didn't think, after studying this for a long time, that these phenomena could be explained by anything physical, like in the physical brain. The reason is that only 18% of people who have heart attacks or drown or experience brain death or clinical death, only 18% have near-death experiences. The remainder do not. And as Van Lommel reasons, if this were really attributable to a physical phenomena, then you would expect that 100% of people would have these experiences if it were attributable, for example, to the brain shutting down or to morphine or other drugs that might have been administered at the time, or, for example, to some phenomenon like receiving extraordinary amounts of oxygen. Well, all these patients had received very, very similar treatment, and the patients also in the control groups. One would expect 100% of patients to have near-death experiences if they were attributable to these physical phenomena, but only 18% have the experience. Within that 18%, however, there is astounding confirmation that human self-consciousness has actually survived bodily death. For example, in many of the near-death experiences, the person or persons have left their bodies and they're hovering above their bodies, and they're describing all of the procedures that are going on in the operating room as the steps taken to resuscitate them occur. Some of them, for example, will report, oh, I know where my lost dentures are. When the nurse took them out of my mouth when I was clinically dead, she put it under this particular machine over here. And lo and behold, the dentures are there. We would call that a veridical experience. That is to say, it is verifiable by some datum after the fact. So, of course, other patients report, oh, there's a crack in this light fixture over here in the corner of the operating room. And sure enough, there it is. Again, another veridical experience. Or I passed through the walls of the operating room and went to the waiting room next door and heard this precise conversation taking place between two people who were wearing these kinds of clothes. And sure enough, they were, and they did have that conversation. Or the nurses in this particular operating room looked like this, and the one who was doing this procedure looked like that, and so forth and so on. But countless times within this 18% that did have near-death experience, veridical, that is to say, verifiable experiences were recounted and in turn verified by physicians or others studying the phenomenon after the fact. How can this occur when the patient is brain dead? How can this occur when there is no gag reflex, fixed and dilated pupils, and no electrical activity in the cortex? Very peculiar indeed, unless in some way human consciousness has survived bodily death. The second piece of evidence that you might be interested in related to this is that blind people actually have near-death experiences where they can see. Most of the people in the studies of Dr. Kenneth Ring, but also in the Van Lommel studies and other studies, most of these people were blind from birth. They had no experience of seeing before. Yet these people not only were able to see, 80% of them were able to see in their near-death experiences, and even more importantly, their experiences were also verifiable or veridical. That is to say, they saw particular things which could be verified after the fact, and indeed they reported accurately precisely what was going on in the room when they had been blind all of their lives. Again, the question emerges, just how would this be possible if human consciousness had not survived bodily death? Third, Dr. Melvin Morse of the University of Washington actually did an extensive study of near-death experiences of children. But what he also did was he measured the death anxiety by two distinct tests. He measured the death anxiety in the adults of people who had come close to death, those having genuine near-death experiences, and those who had died, had a clinical death, but did not have a near-death experience. Now, what's very interesting is almost in all the cases, those children who had near-death experiences as adults experienced virtually no fear of death whatsoever. The same group who did not have a near-death experience but came exceedingly close to death, had a heart attack, etc., but they didn't have a near-death experience, they, in turn, had a very high measurable anxiety of death, and sometimes higher than the average population. How can that be explained really statistically unless there was something that allowed these people to suddenly allow the fear of death to subside, not only in their conscious mind, but in their subconscious mind? What could sort of reach into the subconscious mind and cure the fear of death? Fourth area that's very important that started with Dr. Raymond Moody and then was confirmed by George Gallup in a very important Gallup poll in 1983 was that there are a lot of similar experiences that happen to people in near-death experiences besides leaving their body, being able to report veridical experiences when they are out of their body in clinical death, and the death and not having the death anxiety. What basically occurs is many of these people go, as it were, to the other side, and they have very clear experiences of deceased relatives, some of whom they had never met before, but these relatives would come down and meet them. That's a very similar experience. And of course, George Gallup sort of totaled these in his poll, and those statistics are easily available through Google. And the same thing holds true for many who experienced a white light, a loving white light that came to them and sort of pervaded them, but didn't overpower them, but kind of loved them into another realm, communicated with them as well. Some people had a profound experience of Jesus and so forth. So what we notice is that there are clear experiences that are correlative. That is to say, they occurred over many patients, and they're very similar to a large number of people who had near-death experiences. And all of these things seem to be verified in the fact that human self-consciousness, the soul, seems to survive bodily death and seems to be able to report veridically what's going on, even with blind people losing the death anxiety and even moving to the other side in remarkably consistent experiences of loving white lights, of deceased relatives, and of Jesus. This is just a sampler of the evidence which Dr. Hawking forgot to mention in his remarkable statement, but which you might be interested in knowing. For more about this, connect with our website, magisreasonfaith.org, MAGIS, reasonfaith.org. Thank you so very much.